everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, April 10th, 2023. So last week we were talking about Jacques Derrida and his idea that every other is absolutely other. Today I want to push that idea a little bit further and think about his notion of the democracy to come. Now, in order to think about why a democracy would always be coming and never yet here, I think we've got to situate his notion in light of Soren Kierkegaard's idea of becoming a Christian and even becoming a self. Now, this idea of thinking about becoming a self is, in Derrida's mind, also an invitation to thinking about how we then live together in society. Well, what should define our social lives? How should we make sense of what we strive to do together as peoples in a political context, in a social structure, in communities? Derrida says that the democracy to come is radically identified by an absolute commitment to hospitality, a commitment to absolute hospitality. Now, by this, he's suggesting that we are always trying to find ways to say yes, to invite others to come to the deliberative table, to be part of our democratic structure. The problem, of course, is that for any democracy or any social structure as such, for it to be instantiated in practice is necessarily for it to participate in some degree of exclusion. For us to say this group rather than that, this democracy rather than the other one, is necessarily to draw some boundary, to have some sort of line beyond which participation then becomes difficult. This means that when we think about a particular historical instantiated democratic society, we are always running up against the democratic requirement of the virtue of absolute hospitality and the historical necessity of delimiting the boundaries of a particular political space. How do we navigate that tension? Well, Derrida's idea of the democracy to come is the attempt to understand what it looks like to live here toward where we are not yet. This means that we've got to rethink how we narrate justice here and now. So in our practiced democracy, the democracy in which we find ourselves living, it's necessarily going to be the case that we are trying to think of justice for all. But all is going to be some sort of category by which necessarily some fall out. What would it look like, Derrida sort of invites us to think, if we tried to conceive of a justice for each? What if justice were something that was only just insofar as it recognizes its constitutive injustice? It's never just enough. Similarly, the democracy committed to justice as this ongoing, constant task of radical hospitality to each and every other, it would be a democracy that is democratic insofar as it recognizes its constitutive need to become ever more democratic, more inclusive, more involving. Now, we might say as a response, well, Derrida, that's cool and all, but the problem is intractable. The fact that we always have to exclude in order to have any historical community, doesn't that mean then that in order to think about a democracy to come, there could be no limits, there would be no boundaries? And if there are no boundaries, then it's not clear that this would even be a community, be a society. Well, Derrida kind of bites this bullet and says at one point that the democracy that would be truly democratic, truly committed to this to-come structure, would be so hospitable that it is even welcoming to the enemies of democracy. Now, that's a big bullet to bite. How is it that we could have a social structure that is so inclusive, so welcoming, that even those who would want to eliminate democracy would be welcome at the table? Here I think we've got to parse Derrida's discourse a little bit from the sort of moral implications of what he's trying to get us to think through. In practice, I think that Derrida would be the first to admit we've got to recognize that those who want to eliminate the discursive table, to destroy democracy, are going to have to be the ones excluded from the conversation about how to navigate democratic life. This is, in fact, why, even though every other is absolutely other, we've got to make decisions and calculate and wrestle with the very real situations where some others are trying to do harm and violence to other others. So that exclusion that occurs is something that is necessary for our historical embodied practices, but it's important to realize that it names a failure of our structure itself. The fact that we haven't gotten to the point where such exclusion becomes unnecessary just indicates that we still have more work to do. I want to suggest that Derrida's idea of the democracy to come is not devastated by the fact of historical exclusion, but instead it names such exclusion as the thing that we are always trying to figure out a way to minimize. Our moral task, our ethical dimension in our political life continues so long as such exclusion is also prominent in our social spaces, in our communities. So what we have to do, I believe, is understand that we need to reflect. We need to pray about how do I live? How do I act? Now, I'm using this as an analogy. It does not need to be thought of as a religious concept. Prayer simply as the idea of recognizing that I could mess up, I could go wrong, and I need to think well about how to do something and do it right. But then I've got to act. I can't sit on fences forever. I can't just get ground to a halt by the undecidability of a particular decision. I've got to make a decision, and I've got to own the fact that making that decision implicates me then in the consequences that result from it. But praying, reflection, action, the decision that I then live into because of my agency, this always has to be followed by asking forgiveness. In other words, being self-critical, recognizing that no matter what I've done, no matter how well I've tried to do it, there's probably something that has fallen out. There's always someone I've forgotten. The inclusion was not absolute. The hospitality was limited. So what is it that we can take away, the lessons from this idea of the democracy to come, and justice being a task of absolute hospitality? I want to suggest that what it does is it gets us a future-oriented understanding of communal life. Rather than looking back to when things were, good, some might even say great, that notion is actually misguided. The goal is to look backwards in order to see the constitutive injustice, the failures of our democratic discourse, in order to try to live forward differently. And whenever we've done what we can, then to hear Levinas, to hear Derrida, to hear Kierkegaard, all reminding us, but there's more left to do. Justice for all requires we consider justice for each. How can we live further toward democracy, further toward justice, without being seduced by the idolatry of trying to make something great again? Let's actually realize that we are only great when we are becoming increasingly hospitable to those who are rightly critical of what it is we have been and where it is that we are likely to go if we're not careful. I hope this is helpful. I look forward to continuing to think with you. Make sure to like, to subscribe. Check out my website, jaaronsimmons.com. Get subscribed to my newsletter over there. Drop comments if you've got questions or suggestions for other videos, ideas that you want me to consider. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.